In the autumn of 2011, a woman stood in a courtroom in Charlottesville, Virginia, and watched 20 years of her life sold for less than the cost of building one of its rooms. The buyer was Donald Trump. The price was a fraction of what she'd spent. And the home, Albemarle House, 45 rooms, hand-carved limestone, a library that could have belonged to an English duke, was gone before lunch. Patricia Kluge had once held $100 million in her hands. She had poured it, almost lovingly, into the red clay soil of Virginia, and the soil had taken everything she gave it and given almost nothing back. This is the story of how you can win the lottery twice and still end up with nothing. She was born Patricia Rose in 1944 in Baghdad to a Scottish father and an Iraqi mother. The details of her early life are even now somewhat opaque. What is documented is the trajectory, from Baghdad to London, from London to a modeling career in the 1960s, from modeling to a brief first marriage, and then into the orbit of the kind of men who move through the world as though gravity is optional. By the mid-1970s, she had become Patricia Gay, briefly, before becoming someone else entirely. There are accounts of her working in the adult film industry in the early 1970s under a different name, a chapter her later public life worked hard to leave behind. What matters for this story is not the moral weight of those years, but what they tell us about her ambition. She was a woman who understood that reinvention was a survival skill, and she practiced it with discipline. In 1981, she married John Kluge. John Werner Kluge was, at that point, one of the richest men in the United States. Born in Germany in 1914, he'd immigrated to America as a child, worked his way through Columbia University, and built Metromedia, a broadcasting and entertainment conglomerate that, at its height, owned television stations, radio stations, outdoor advertising, and the Harlem Globetrotters. When Rupert Murdoch bought Metromedia's television stations in 1986 to create the Fox Broadcasting Network, the transaction, valued at roughly $1.6 billion, made John Kluge's fortune almost incalculable by the standards of that era. Forbes listed him as the richest man in America in 1989, with a net worth north of $5 billion. Patricia was his third wife. She was 37, he was 67. They married quietly, then lived loudly. Their primary home was Albemarle House, a 45-room estate on 2,500 acres in Charlottesville, Virginia, the kind of property that doesn't just suggest old money, it insists upon it. The architecture was Georgian Revival, built to evoke the great country houses of England. There was a chapel. There was a swimming pool, whose dimensions were described in one profile as the size of a small lake. There were formal gardens that required a full-time horticultural staff. The art collection inside required its own insurance policy. They entertained at a scale that made the word entertaining feel inadequate. State dinners had fewer moving parts. Margaret Thatcher visited. So did the Prince of Wales. The guest lists read like the index of a biography of the 20th century. For about a decade, this was Patricia Kluge's world. Then, in 1990, John Kluge filed for divorce. The settlement, negotiated and finalized by 1991, reportedly gave Patricia somewhere in the range of $100 million, plus Albemarle House itself and the surrounding estate. The exact figure has never been definitively confirmed publicly, but it was widely reported as among the largest divorce settlements in American history at that time. $100 million in 1991 is roughly $220 million in today's purchasing power. She also received ongoing spousal support for a period of years. She was 46 years old. She owned a palace and enough money to fund several small nations. She had, in the language of the tabloids, won. And then she decided to build something. The land around Albemarle House had some vineyards. Virginia wine country, for all its beauty, was not yet taken seriously, not by sommeliers, not by investors, not by the wine press. But Patricia Kluge looked at those rolling hills and the particular quality of the light in the Shenandoah foothills, and she saw not a hobby but an empire. She hired winemakers from France. She planted varietals that the Virginia climate had never been asked to support at scale. She expanded the vineyard from a handful of acres to hundreds. She built a production facility. She built a tasting room. She rebranded the whole operation as Kluge Estate Winery and Vineyard. She was going to put Virginia wine on the international map. The ambition was genuine, and in some ways so was the execution. Kluge Estate won awards. Its sparkling wine, a Méthode Champenoise produced under the label New World, received legitimate critical attention. Visitors came. The tasting room was gorgeous. There were charitable events, harvest festivals, the kind of high-profile gatherings that kept the Kluge name in the society pages. But the economics of building a serious winery from scratch in a region that had no established international reputation are brutal in ways that don't show up in the early press coverage. Viticulture at this scale requires years, sometimes a decade or more, before a vineyard reaches consistent maturity. The infrastructure costs are staggering before the first bottle ever sells. And selling wine at the premium price point Kluge Estate demanded required sustained, expensive marketing to an audience that hadn't been told yet that Virginia wine was worth those prices. Patricia Kluge spent. Year after year, the estate expanded. A spa was added. The hospitality offerings grew. There was construction on the grounds that seemed, from the outside, almost continuous. Reports from that period suggest the operation was burning through capital at a rate that her divorce settlement, however large, could not sustain indefinitely. Here is where the story turns quiet and cold. The spending and the borrowing happened gradually enough that each individual decision seemed defensible. A new tasting room, defensible. An expanded production facility, defensible. More vineyard acreage, defensible. A luxury hospitality component, defensible. But the cumulative weight of each defensible decision was a mountain of debt that only made sense if the wine empire eventually generated the kind of revenue that, in Virginia, in that era, it simply wasn't going to generate fast enough. She took out loans, then more loans. She used Albemarle House itself as collateral, the house she'd received in her divorce settlement, the one asset that was supposed to be, in every possible sense, untouchable. Reports indicate she borrowed tens of millions of dollars against the property. One account put the total debt load on the estate at somewhere around $30 million by the mid-2000s. John Kluge, her former husband, became a financial backer at some point during this period, lending or investing in the winery operation. It's one of the more quietly remarkable footnotes in the story. The man who'd paid her $100 million to leave was now, years later, effectively underwriting her dream. The exact terms and extent of his involvement have never been fully detailed publicly, but it speaks to something, perhaps to the genuine respect they maintained, or perhaps simply to the size of the numbers she needed. Then, in 2008, the financial crisis arrived. For a heavily leveraged luxury estate winery dependent on high-net-worth visitors and premium pricing, the 2008 crash was not a headwind. It was a wall. Luxury spending collapsed. Fine dining revenues fell. The kind of wealthy tourist who flies to Charlottesville for a wine weekend started staying home. The market for premium Virginia wine, never robust, went quiet. And the loans on Albemarle House, secured against an asset whose value was now uncertain and whose income stream had dried up, began to come due. John Kluge died in September 2010. He was 95 years old, and he left an estate worth an estimated $600 million to charity and to children from his other marriages. Patricia was not in that will. Whatever support or investment he had provided through the winery, whatever informal lifeline had existed, ended with him. She was on her own, with the debt, with the declining revenue, and with a house that was now more burden than sanctuary. By early 2011, the banks moved. The properties were posted for foreclosure. Albemarle House, all 45 rooms, the chapel, the gardens, the swimming pool, the art-lined walls, went to auction. The winery and its acreage went separately. Donald Trump bought the winery property, roughly 1,100 acres including the vineyards, production facilities, and ancillary buildings, for a reported $7.5 million. Given the scale of what had been built there over 2 decades, the price was devastating in its smallness. It was pennies on the dollar against what had been invested. Trump later rebranded it as Trump Winery, which today operates as one of the largest wineries on the East Coast. Albemarle House itself was auctioned and eventually sold to a private buyer. The 45-room manor that had hosted British royalty and heads of state, that had been the center of Patricia Kluge's social universe for 3 decades, left her hands in a foreclosure proceeding. She was 67 years old. The $100 million divorce settlement, every dollar of it was gone. Patricia Kluge's life after the collapse has been, by any measure, quiet. She has given very few interviews. She has not written a memoir, has not appeared on the documentary circuit, has not sought the kind of public rehabilitation that some fallen figures pursue. A collaboration with Trump on a wine label, Patricia Kluge had reportedly entered into some business arrangement related to her expertise and brand during or after the sale, was one of the few documented public footnotes. The details, like so much of her later life, were sparse. She still has her name. She still has the knowledge she accumulated over 20 years of learning, genuinely, how to grow grapes in Virginia red clay and coax them into something that critics noticed. What she doesn't have is the empire, the house, the 100 million, or the margin for error. The forensics of this story, if you lay them out clearly, reveal something uncomfortable. Patricia Kluge didn't lose her fortune to fraud, to theft, or to a single catastrophic gamble. She lost it to accumulation, to the compounding weight of ambition applied to an industry with notoriously thin margins, in a region without the established reputation to support premium pricing, over a timeline that required either infinite patience or infinite capital, and she had neither. She also lost it, in a specific and documented way, to collateral. The decision to borrow against Albemarle House, to use the house itself as the financial engine of the winery's expansion, was the hinge point. That house was the one thing her divorce settlement had given her that the winery's revenues could never threaten, until she made them one and the same. Once the house became collateral, its fate was tied to the vintage. And the vintage, in 2008 and 2009 and 2010, was terrible not in the fields, but in the economy. There is something worth sitting with in the image of Donald Trump at that auction. Not politically, this is not that story, but symbolically. Here was a man whose entire brand was built on the projection of wealth, buying at foreclosure discount the ruins of a woman's attempt to build something real. He then put his name on it. The winery still operates, still produces wine from the vines she planted, and carries a name that has nothing to do with the woman who spent 20 years building it. Patricia Kluge's name is on nothing now that she owns. The wine writers who visit Trump Winery, who taste the sparkling wine made in the Méthode Champenois style she established, are generally unaware that the vineyards they're standing in were planted by someone else's obsession. The infrastructure they're walking through was built with money from a divorce settlement that is now entirely gone. History doesn't always preserve the names of the people who built things, particularly when someone with a larger megaphone buys the building at auction and puts his own name above the door. What this story resists is easy judgment. It is genuinely difficult to stand outside a life and say with confidence where ambition crosses into recklessness, where investment becomes overextension, where passion for a project stops being a virtue and starts being a liability. Patricia Kluge built something. It was real. It won awards and changed, in modest but documented ways, how the wine world thought about Virginia. That achievement didn't save her financially, but it was an achievement. She had $100 million, and she spent it trying to build something that mattered to her. The spending was real, the loss was real, and the particular cruelty of her situation, that the thing she built ended up carrying someone else's name, is the detail that stays with you. Fortunes are lost in many ways, sometimes in a single reckless afternoon, sometimes in a slow bleed of quarterly losses nobody wanted to look at directly. Patricia Kluge's money left the way water leaves a cracked vessel, not in a rush, but steadily, and then all at once, and then there was nothing left. She had stood in those vineyards in the Virginia summer, with her French winemakers and her English manor and her French sparkling wine, and she had believed, genuinely, that she was building something that would outlast her. It did, she just doesn't own it anymore.